Such a capable old cowboy deserves to pass on his genes, said the stunned Apache woman. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The New Mexico Territory in the fall of 1881 was a place where silence carried more weight than words. Wind moved low across the hardpan earth, stirring dust along fence lines and through patches of dry mesquite. Garrett Boone stood at the edge of his ranch, tightening the last line of wire around a post he had set the day before. He worked with the steady rhythm of a man who had done this kind of job his whole life, muscles heavy but trained, his broad frame moving slower than it once had yet never wasting a motion. His boots were scuffed from years of use, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbow, showing arms scarred from ropes, barbed wire, and work that never ended. Garrett was 50, gray showing along his beard and hair, and carried the wear of a man who had seen both the trail and the grave. Once, years back, he had led herds up from Texas into Kansas, known as a trail boss who could outlast most men and keep order when tempers or storms rose. But the life had stripped more from him than it gave. His wife and young son had died in camp during a fever outbreak, and after that Garrett had left the cattle drives behind. He bought this stretch of rough land with what savings he had, built a cabin, and worked the soil and small herd in silence. It was not ambition that kept him going, but routine, the need to fill each day with something so he would not drown in memory. By late afternoon, he was finishing his line of posts when he noticed movement along the far edge of the property. His first thought was that it might be a stray calf, or worse, someone testing the fences. His hand went to the revolver at his belt, instinct more than fear, though he carried little worth stealing. He shaded his eyes against the lowering sun and fixed on the figure. It was not livestock. It was a woman. She staggered, her steps uneven, and the closer Garrett walked, the clearer the details became. Bronze skin streaked with dust, long black hair tangled and hanging loose, small feathers and strips of leather still clinging where braids had once been. Her deerskin dress was torn at the neckline and waist, beads broken or missing, fabric stretched and hanging low enough to show bruises on her shoulder and across her chest. She looked no older than her early 30s, but bore the exhaustion of someone who had been pushed to her limits. Garrett slowed, weighing what he saw. In this land, people didn't appear out of nowhere without reason. Apache raids and reprisals had been running back and forth for years. He had kept himself clear of both sides, but it was plain enough she had been caught up in something violent. He felt a pull of caution. Taking her in might mean trouble, but the sight of her knees buckling and her body folding into the dirt cut through it. When he reached her, she was on her hands and knees, head lowered, hair hanging to the ground. Garrett crouched, his voice rough from disuse. "You're not going any farther like this." Her head lifted slightly. Dark eyes met his, sharp and defiant despite her state. There was no begging in her expression, only a tightness around the mouth that told him she would rather break than ask. He recognized that look. He had carried it himself once, when grief had left him hollow and men still expected him to stand tall. She swayed forward, catching herself clumsily with one hand. Garrett didn't waste more words. He slid his arms under her and lifted her against his chest. For a second she stiffened, her small muscles going tense, but she had no strength left to fight. He felt her heat through the torn hide of her clothing, too warm for someone who had been outside in the cooling evening. Fever, exhaustion, or both. Garrett's thoughts worked fast as he carried her. He knew what risk there was in bringing an Apache woman into his home. The army patrols passed by once in a while, and neighbors in the nearest town 30 miles off already called him odd for living alone. But leaving her was no choice at all. He would not watch another life fade when he had the strength to prevent it. He had buried enough. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had gone orange along the horizon. He nudged the door open with his boot and stepped inside, the scent of smoke and beans still lingering from his midday meal. He laid her on the bunk in the corner, the quilt folded back to give her space, then poured water into a tin cup. Setting it in her hand, he stayed close enough to catch it if she dropped it. She drank, slow but steady, eyes never leaving him. Garrett felt a flicker of unease under her gaze. Not fear of her, but of what it meant to have another set of eyes in his cabin after so many years alone. He busied himself at the stove, scooping out a portion of beans into a bowl. When he set it near her, she ate with small, careful bites, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. He sat down near the door, rifle leaned close, eyes on her, but saying nothing. Questions pressed in, who she was, where she had come from, what she was running from, but he kept them back. If she wanted him to know, she would speak. That night, the firelight played across the cabin walls. The woman lay beneath the quilt, awake though her eyes were closed, her breathing uneven. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his mind circling through what had just unfolded. He thought of the dangers, the judgment of others, the possibility of drawing violence to his doorstep. But he also thought of the bruises on her skin, of the way she had stood upright until her body betrayed her, of the pride in her face when she looked at him. For years the cabin had been filled with silence he thought he had earned, silence he had accepted as the shape of his life. Now it was broken by the sound of another person breathing under his roof. Garrett sat with that sound and realized he was not as sure about the life he had built as he once believed. He did not sleep easy, but he knew with certainty that the decision had been made. He would see this woman through the night. Tomorrow could bring whatever it wanted. The night passed slow, the fire snapping low on the hearth, and Garrett Boone woke at dawn the way he always did, body stiff from the chair he had chosen rather than his bed. His rifle rested within reach, though no trouble had come in the dark hours. The woman was still there, lying under the quilt on the bunk. For a moment, he thought she might not have survived the night. Her body was so still, but then he heard her breath, faint and steady. Relief worked through him quietly, not on his face, but deep in his chest where it stayed hidden. He stood and moved carefully, stoking the fire and setting a pot of water to boil. Habit carried him through the small motions, laying out coffee grounds, checking the stock of beans and cornmeal, and cutting a strip of salt pork to cook. It was the same morning routine he had done for years, except this time he was not alone. When the smell of coffee filled the cabin, the woman stirred. She shifted under the quilt and turned her face toward him, her eyes opening with effort. Garrett met her gaze. "Morning," he said, voice low. She did not answer, only watched him, as if measuring what kind of man he was now that she could truly see him in daylight. Her eyes lingered on his gray hair, the lined face, the broad shoulders under a worn shirt. She seemed wary, but not afraid. He poured her a cup of water, set it on the table within reach. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the pain in her ribs, the quilt slipping down enough for Garrett to notice the bruises spread across her shoulder and chest. He looked away out of respect, busying himself with the pan. He could feel her eyes on him still, sharp and testing. When he brought her a plate of food, beans, pork, and a piece of hard bread, she took it with both hands. She ate cautiously at first, then with hunger she could not mask. Garrett sat across the table from her, his own plate in front of him, though he watched more than he ate. "Name's Garrett Boone," he said finally, breaking the silence. "This land's mine, few miles outside of Arroyo Wells. Ain't much, but it's quiet." Her fort paused. She lifted her eyes to him, and after a long moment she spoke, her voice rough, accented, but clear enough. "Ahiona." Garrett gave a small nod. It was more than he expected, and he knew better than to press. Still, questions filled his mind. How she had come this far, what had happened to her husband or kin, how long she had been running. He saw the marks on her body and knew men had had a hand in it. He didn't ask, because he understood what it was to carry things you weren't ready to speak. After breakfast, Garrett set about the day's work. He needed to haul water from the well, check the animals, and mend a loose hinge on the barn. He kept half an eye on Ahiona while he worked, noticing the way she followed his movements with quiet attention. At one point she rose, unsteady but determined, and began to gather the quilt neatly. She moved slow, favoring one side, but she did not want to lie useless. Garrett stepped inside as she tried to fold the blanket. "You need rest," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. She looked at him, lips pressed tight. "I can do," she answered. Her words were few, but her meaning was plain. Garrett hesitated. He knew pride when he saw it. And he also knew that if he stripped her of work, she would feel stripped of dignity. He gave a small nod. All right, but easy. By midday, Ahiona had set herself by the fire pit, grinding dried corn with the small stone mortar Garrett's wife had once used. The sound of the stone against stone echoed in the room. Garrett, out in the yard, swung the axe steady into a block of wood, the thud of it carrying in rhythm. The two sounds wove together, with splitting, stone grinding, unplanned but even. When he carried in the cut wood, Ahiona looked up. For a moment their eyes held, both of them aware that silence had turned into something shared, not empty. Garrett set the wood by the stove without a word and stepped back out, his chest feeling heavier than the work alone could explain. That evening, as the light faded, Garrett sat by the table mending a length of tack with his knife, while Ahiona patched one of her torn seams with thread she had found in his chest. She sat straight, her dark hair falling forward as she worked, her fingers quick despite her injuries. Garrett glanced up once, catching the way the neckline of her dress shifted lower as she leaned. He looked back down immediately, jaw tight, ashamed of himself for noticing. It was impossible not to. She was beautiful, and more than that, she was alive in a cabin that had long felt more like a tomb. When the lamps were lit, Garrett finally asked what had weighed on his mind since he found her. You alone out there? His voice was quiet, careful. Ahiona's sewing hand stilled. Her face changed, tightening, and she lowered her eyes. My husband, my brothers, all gone. Soldiers came, then others. She stopped, lips pressing hard, as if the words cost more than she could afford. Garrett felt the old burn of anger rise. He had seen enough of raids, reprisals, and soldiers treating women like spoils. He knew what kind of violence left bruises like hers. He gripped the piece of leather in his hand harder than he meant to. You're safe here, he said finally. It was not a promise made lightly, but he meant it. She met his eyes again, steady now. There was no thank you, no softening in her expression, but there was recognition. She understood what it meant for him to say it. That night, when Garrett laid his rifle within reach and settled back into the chair, the cabin felt different. The silence wasn't the emptiness of years past. It was weighted, full of presence. He could sense her breathing, could hear the faint sound of fabric as she shifted on the bunk. He thought of the risk he had taken, of what trouble might come if the wrong men knew she was here, but he also thought of the way she had straightened her back when speaking of loss, refusing pity. Garrett stared into the low fire, his jaw set. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing with certainty. He had not saved her to watch her fade. He had chosen, against all caution, to let her inside his cabin and into his life, and there would be no turning back. Morning came clear and cold, a thin frost clinging to the edges of the corral fence. Garrett Boone rose from the chair he had claimed again for sleep, his back stiff but his mind sharp. He had not rested well, though his eyes had closed in short intervals. The steady sound of another person breathing in the cabin unsettled him, not in fear, but in the reminder that the quiet order of his life was broken. He stood and moved to the stove, adding kindling and coaxing the fire to life, the familiar rhythm helping to settle his thoughts. Behind him, Ahiona stirred on the bunk, her hand moving first, then her shoulders. She pushed herself upright, her hair falling forward across her face. The bruises along her collarbone showed darker in the morning light, and Garrett felt his jaw tighten. He busied himself pouring water into the kettle, letting her take her time. When the coffee was set to boil, he spoke. You slept. She nodded once. Her voice was quiet but steady. Better than outside. He gave a short grunt of agreement, not trusting himself to say more. He had wondered how she had managed before he found her, where she had hidden, how long she had gone without food. The questions had pressed on him the night before, and he knew anyone listening to the story would ask the same. You were out there long? He asked, turning to face her fully. Ahiona's eyes met his sharp and steady. 2 days. No water. Before that, I hid with others. She paused, her throat tightening as if the words were caught. Soldiers found us. My husband fought. He died. I ran. Garrett absorbed her words in silence. He had buried too many to ask for details she didn't want to give. But the picture was clear enough. Loss, flight, survival on nothing but will. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then set 2 tin plates on the table with beans and bread. She rose slow, moving carefully, her body stiff with pain. They ate without speaking much. Garrett noticed the way she held herself, never slouching, never showing more weakness than she had to. She chewed carefully, her eyes lowering whenever his gaze lingered on her too long. When the plates were cleared, Garrett pulled on his vest and stepped toward the door. Need to bring in wood. Pump water. Feedstock. Ahiona stood, quilt folded neatly across the bunk. I help, she said. Garrett hesitated. His instinct was to tell her no, to keep her resting until her body recovered. But he remembered the stubborn set of her jaw the day before, how she had insisted on doing small tasks. He understood. Work was not only survival but dignity. He gave a small nod. Come then. Slow. Outside the air was crisp, the sky a pale blue. Garrett led her first to the pump. He showed her the handle, heavy iron worn smooth from use, and worked it a few times until water splashed into the bucket. She stepped forward and tried, her arms trembling as she pressed the handle down, but she managed. Garrett stood close, ready to steady her if she faltered. She caught his eye, and for a moment neither spoke, but something passed between them. Respect, recognition that both were choosing to labor side by side. With the water carried in, Garrett moved to the woodpile. He split logs with practiced swings, the axe biting deep. Ahiona knelt near the cut pieces, stacking them into neat rows, her hands sure even if her strength faltered. They worked in rhythm again, the sounds of wood splitting and wood stacking filling the yard. Garrett felt the weight of her presence not as a burden, but as a reminder of life moving forward. By midday, she had tired, her breath heavy, so he guided her back to the cabin. She sank onto the chair by the fire, her body trembling faintly. Garrett set a cup of coffee in her hands and watched her drink. You got people left? He asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Her eyes lifted slowly. No, none now. Husband, brothers gone. My people scattered. She spoke with finality, as if rehearsed by pain. Then, quieter, she added, I thought I would die too. Garrett felt a sharp twist in his chest. He had thought the same once. Sitting by 2 graves, he dug himself on the trail. The memory pressed on him, and he spoke before he could stop himself. I buried a wife and a boy. Fever took him. His voice was flat, but the weight behind it showed. Ahiona's eyes softened, not in pity, but in recognition. She nodded once, as if to say she understood without needing more words. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. That evening, as shadows stretched across the yard, they settled into quieter work. Garrett cleaned his rifle on the table, oiling the parts with steady hands. Ahiona mended another seam in her dress, this time reinforcing it where the tear had left more skin bare than she wanted. Garrett noticed, but said nothing, though his eyes flicked to her more often than he meant. When she set the needle down, she spoke again. Why you live alone? Garrett paused, the cloth still in his hand. He had not been asked that in years. After they died, I didn't see the point in towns or trails. Too much talk, too many eyes. Here it's quiet. Work keeps the days filled. He looked at her steady. Not much else. She studied him, her dark eyes unreadable. You kept me alive, she said finally. The words were plain, not meant as thanks, but as a statement of fact. Garrett gave a short nod. Seemed the right thing. The fire cracked between them. He felt the pull of something he had not allowed himself in years. Connection. He noticed the curve of her shoulder, the way her hair caught the firelight, the strength in her gaze despite the hurt she carried. He turned back to the rifle, jaw tight, unwilling to let himself linger too long. When night came and the fire burned low, Ahiona lay again on the bunk, eyes half closed. Garrett sat in his chair, rifle near, staring at the coals. He thought of what she had told him, of her losses of his own. He thought of how easily he could have left her by the fence line and how different the cabin felt now, because he had not. For the first time in many years, Garrett Boone felt the stir of something he had buried deep. The thought that maybe survival was not meant to be done alone. The next morning came cold again, the kind of sharp air that bit at the lungs when you stepped outside too fast. Garrett Boone rose before the light, the way years of routine had taught him, though his movements were slower now. He pulled on his boots by the door, listening to the quiet shift of Ahiona moving in the bunk behind him. Her presence had already become a constant in the cabin, something he noticed the way he noticed the fire needing wood or the animals needing feed. For a man who had lived in silence for so long, the change was unsettling, yet he found he did not resent it. He stepped outside, lantern swinging in his hand, and walked toward the barn. Frost covered the ground, the boards creaking under his weight. He tossed feed for the chickens, drew hay for the horse, and checked the water trough. When he turned back toward the cabin, the faint light of dawn had begun to show. Through the open door, he saw Ahiona on her feet, steady but moving carefully, the quilt folded again and set aside. She had cleared the table and was tending the fire, her dark hair falling forward as she bent. The bruises across her shoulder were still visible where the neckline of her patched dress slipped, but she carried herself straight, refusing to show weakness. Inside, Garrett set the lantern down and poured water for both of them. She accepted the cup, her hand brushing his briefly, and for a moment he felt the warmth of her skin against his calloused fingers. It was nothing more than a passing touch, but it stayed with him longer than it should have. They ate a quiet breakfast, beans and bread, with coffee strong enough to cut the morning chill. Garrett spoke little, though he caught himself wanting to fill the silence with words. Instead, it was Ahiona who asked, her voice quiet but direct, "Why you no leave this place? You have no family here." The question pressed against something in him he usually left alone. He set his cup down slow. "I came here because it was far, far from the graves, far from a trail. Out here, nobody expects me to be anything. Just a man keeping his land." She studied him with sharp eyes. "But alone." Garrett gave a small shrug. "Easier that way. Fewer losses when there's nobody left to lose." He had not meant to say so much, but once spoken it sat heavy between them. Ahiona lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around her cup. "I thought the same," she said after a pause. "Better to be nothing, to go quiet. But hunger still comes. Cold still comes. Alone makes it worse." Her words cut closer than he liked. He looked at her longer than before, noticing not just her bruises, but the resilience behind them. She had endured raids, soldiers, hunger, and still she sat tall at his table, refusing pity. He felt a weight in his chest that was not grief this time, but something else he did not yet name. After breakfast, Garrett set out to mend the section of fence closest to the creek. Ahiona followed, carrying a small bundle of tools despite his warning. Her steps were slower than his, but she kept up, her determination plain. At the fence line she knelt, holding nails and wire while he hammered. Her hands were steady, her focus sharp, and though her strength had not fully returned, she refused to let him do all the work. At one point the hammer slipped and clipped his thumb. He swore under his breath and shook his hand. Ahiona looked up quickly, concern flickering across her face, and without hesitation she reached for his hand. Her fingers closed gently around his, steadying him. The touch was brief, but Garrett felt the jolt of it run through him. He pulled back slowly, clearing his throat. "Just a scrape." She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on him longer than before. By midday, they returned to the cabin. Garrett prepared a stew, stirring the pot, while Ahiona ground more corn at the table. The two sounds filled the small space, a rhythm that felt natural now. When he set the bowls down, she looked at him and spoke again. "You had wife. You said she died." Garrett froze a moment, spoon in hand. He had not spoken her name in years. "Mary," he said finally. "She was young, strong. Our boy Tom was just 6. Fever took them both. I buried them myself on the trail." His voice stayed even, but his chest tightened. Ahiona lowered her spoon, eyes softening. "I had a husband. His name was Cheno. He died with honor, but still he died. I buried nothing. No time." Her voice shook slightly, but she straightened her back, forcing strength into her words. Garrett looked at her across the table, Two lives shattered in different ways, but carried into the same small cabin. He felt an understanding pass between them, heavier than any spoken promise. That evening, as the firelight filled the room, Garrett worked on sharpening his knife while Ahionas sat on the bunk repairing her dress. The torn seam at the neckline had been stitched, though it still dipped lower than modesty would have chosen. When she leaned forward, the firelight caught on her skin, and Garrett forced himself to keep his eyes on the blade. Yet he noticed, and she must have sensed it, for her lips curved faintly, not in mockery, but in awareness. Later, when he rose to add a log to the fire, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You keep watch every night. You do not sleep in bed." Garrett set the log in place, sparks rising. "Habit. Easier that way." She tilted her head. "You guard me." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Until you're strong enough to guard yourself." Her eyes held his, steady and unflinching. "Then I am not alone." The words struck him harder than he expected. He sat back down, the firelight catching the lines of his face. And for the first time in years, he let himself sit with the feeling of not being alone either. When the cabin quieted for the night, Garrett did not close his eyes quickly. He listened to her breathing, thought of the brush of her hand against his, thought of the way her eyes had softened when speaking of her husband. He felt the stir of something old and dangerous, hope, and he knew it would not be easily set aside. The cold held through the next morning, the air sharp enough that Garrett Boone saw his own breath as soon as he stepped outside with the bucket. He paused on the porch a moment, scanning the ridge lines, a habit he had kept since the trail days. He knew others might come this way, soldiers on patrol, drifters, even neighbors passing through. The thought pressed on him harder now that Ahiona was inside his cabin. People would ask questions. Some might not care that he had offered her shelter, but others would see her presence as trouble. He didn't say any of this out loud, but the worry stayed with him while he pumped water and carried it back. Inside, Ahiona was already at the table, rolling dough between her hands. She had found the sack of flour and set herself to making something more than beans and bread. Garrett stood in the doorway watching her for a moment. Her movements were slower than before, her strength still returning, but there was purpose in every gesture. She glanced up and caught his eyes. "I make food," she said simply. He nodded. "You don't need to push yourself." Her expression didn't change. "I need to." He understood. Word gave order, gave reason. He carried the water to the stove without argument. As the dough baked in the small iron pan, Garrett sat at the table with his coffee. He found himself speaking more than he meant to. "Nearest towns are Royal Wells. About 30 miles. I ride in once a month for salt, flour, whatever's short. Folks there talk too much. They'd ask about you." Ahiona's hands stilled for a moment. Her eyes lifted to him. "You fear them?" Garrett shook his head. "Not fear. Distrust. They look at a man like me and see someone who don't belong. They look at you and..." He didn't finish, but the meaning was clear. He had seen how townsfolk looked at Apache women. Suspicion at best, hatred at worst. Her gaze stayed steady. "Then we stay here." He felt a weight ease in his chest at her plain words. Still, part of him knew it wasn't so simple. Supplies would run out, and sooner or later someone would ride by. But for the moment, her choice settled the matter. When the bread was finished, they ate it hot, the smell filling the cabin. Garrett hadn't tasted food like that since Mary's hands had worked the stove years ago. He chewed in silence, but emotions stirred deep, memories pressing hard. He set his plate down and forced the thought away. Ahiona watched him quietly, reading more in his silence than he wanted to give. Later, they worked outside again. Garrett cut timber for a new fence rail, while Ahiona carried smaller pieces to the stack. At one point, she slipped, her body still too weak for the weight, and he caught her by the arm before she fell. His hand closed around her skin, warm and firm. For a breath, they stood close, her eyes lifting to his, her chest rising quick. Garrett released her slowly, jaw tight. "You're not healed yet," he said. "I heal faster if I move," she answered. He almost smiled at that, but held it back. "Stubborn," he muttered. Her lips curved faintly. "You too." By afternoon, clouds gathered on the horizon, a rare sign of rain. Garrett carried tools back to the barn, Ahiona following with a bucket. The air grew heavy, and when the first drops fell, they hurried into the cabin. Inside, the sound of rain against the roof filled the room. Garrett sat near the fire, pulling off his boots, while Ahiona spread the damp quilt by the hearth to dry. For a long while they listened to the rain. Garrett felt the pull of silence again, but this time it wasn't emptiness. It pressed on him, thick with what neither had said. He looked across the fire at her, the firelight catching on her face, her hair damp from the short dash outside. The neckline of her dress had slipped again, and though she straightened it with a tug, his eyes had already noticed. He forced himself to look away, but not before she caught the movement. She spoke quietly. "You gar me. You work beside me. But you look away when I look at you." Garrett's chest tightened. He kept his eyes on the flames. "Out of respect." Her voice held no anger. "Respect is good, but I am not weak. I know what I choose." He turned then, meeting her gaze. She didn't flinch. The firelight showed the curve of her face, the strength in her eyes despite the bruises still fading across her skin. He felt his own restraint cracking under the weight of it. For years he had buried his wants, convinced himself that part of his life was over. Yet here was a woman, proud and alive, who had chosen to sit by his fire. He set his hands on his knees, fingers curling tight. "Ahiona, you've been hurt. You've lost. Same as me. I don't want to take advantage of that." She rose from the hearth and stepped closer, the soft tread of her bare feet against the wood floor loud in the silence. She stood before him, looking down at his lined face. "You did not take. You gave. Food, shelter, safety. Now I give." Her hand lifted, touching his cheek. The calloused pads of her fingers brushed against the roughness of his beard. Garrett closed his eyes for a moment, the simple human touch striking deeper than he expected. When he opened them, she was still watching him, steady, unafraid. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and covered her hand with his. His chest felt heavy, his breath uneven. He had thought himself past the age of wanting, past the risk of letting someone in again. Yet here he was, holding her hand against his skin as if it were the only thing tethering him. The rain thickened outside, drumming on the roof. Garrett stood, his height casting a shadow across her. For a moment, neither moved, the weight of choice between them. Then, without hurry, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a desperate kiss, but slow, steady, an acknowledgement. She answered, her lips parting slightly, her free hand resting against his chest where his heart hammered. When they pulled back, she did not look away. "You are not alone," she said, her voice low. Garrett swallowed hard, emotion tight in his throat. "No," he admitted, "not anymore." That night, he did not take the chair. For the first time since she had come, he lay beside her on the bunk. The fire burned low, the rain softened outside, and for the first time in years, Garrett Boone let himself close his eyes with someone close enough to touch. The storm broke during the night, leaving the air sharp and clean, the ground soft beneath the morning light. Garrett Boone woke with a heaviness in his chest that wasn't grief this time, but something he hadn't let himself feel in years calm. The fire had burned down to ash, and beside him Ahiona slept, her head resting lightly near his shoulder, one hand curled against the quilt. He lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling beams of the cabin, aware of the warmth of her body against his. He had lived so long with nothing but the sound of his own breath that the quiet rhythm of hers unsettled him and steadied him at the same time. When he rose at last, he pulled on his boots, careful not to wake her. Outside, the ranch carried on as it always had. The horse snorted for feed, the chickens scattered at his approach, and the damp smell of wet earth clung to everything. He moved through the chores automatically, but his mind stayed on the woman inside the cabin. He felt the weight of what had changed between them the night before, and though he had no regrets, questions pressed in. By the time he returned, Ahiona was awake. She sat at the table, hair falling over her shoulders, her dress mended enough to hold together, though still showing the torn edges of her flight. She had the mortar in front of her, grinding dried corn with slow, steady strokes. Garrett paused in the doorway, taking her in, the steadiness of her movements, the way her dark eyes lifted to meet his as if she had been waiting. "You worked already," she said. "Always do," he answered. He set the bucket of water down and leaned against the wall. For a moment, neither spoke, but the air between them felt different now. No longer the fragile balance of strangers sharing space, but the beginning of something heavier, harder to ignore. He finally crossed to the table, poured coffee into 2 cups, and slid one toward her. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his as she took it. "You keep busy," she said quietly. Garrett nodded. "If I stop, I think too much." He didn't plan to say it, but it came out anyway. Her gaze lingered on him. "And now?" He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable under the weight of the question. "Now I think different things." She didn't press, but the curve of her mouth told him she understood. The day settled into work. Garrett cut new rails for the corral, while Ahiona carried smaller branches and gathered kindling. She tired faster than she wanted to admit, but she refused to stop. Garrett watched her from the corner of his eye, torn between letting her work for dignity's sake and stepping in to shield her from strain. When she stumbled over a loose stone and nearly dropped the bundle of wood, he caught her elbow before she fell. "Careful," he said, his voice rough. "I am fine," she insisted, straightening quickly. But her grip on his arm lingered longer than it needed to, and Garrett felt the tension rise in him again. He released her gently, not wanting to embarrass her. By midday, they returned to the cabin. While Ahiona stirred a pot of stew, Garrett cleaned a rifle at the table. His eyes kept drifting to her, and he realized something that had not occurred to him in the first days. She had nowhere else to go. If she left, she would face soldiers, hunger, or worse. If she stayed, she tied her fate to his. The thought both steadied him and unsettled him. He spoke after a long silence. "If someone comes here, patrol, trader, neighbor, they'll ask questions." Ahiona looked up, her spoon pausing. "You hide me." Garrett rubbed his thumb along the barrel of the rifle. "I could, but it won't hold forever. Word gets out. Folks see what they want to see." Her voice was calm. "Then let them see. I am not ashamed." The directness of her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years avoiding notice, hiding grief behind work. She, who had lost everything, refused to be hidden. He nodded slowly. "Then we face it when it comes." That evening, when the chores were finished and the stew eaten, they sat by the fire. Garrett worked on patching a torn glove while Ahiona wove small strands of leatherback into her hair. The firelight made her skin glow bronze, the shadows accentuating the curve of her face and the line of her shoulders. Garrett tried to keep his eyes on his work, but his gaze drifted more often than he meant. After a long silence, she set the leather aside and looked at him directly. "You said you had a wife and boy. You spoke their names. Mary, Tom." Garrett's hand stilled. He nodded once. "Yes. You love them," she said plainly. He drew a slow breath. "I did. Still do. But they're gone. Buried far from here." He looked at her, his voice lower. "I thought that part of me was buried too." Her eyes stayed on his, unflinching. "But not dead." The truth of it settled in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He set the glove aside, leaned back, and studied her. She had survived soldiers, raids, hunger, and grief, and still she sat across from him with her back straight, her gaze steady. He felt something stir in him that was not pity, not loneliness, but the recognition of strength that matched his own. Without thinking too hard, he reached across the table, his hand closing over hers. She didn't pull away. Her fingers were small against his, but her grip was firm, alive. They stayed like that a long moment, the fire crackling between them, neither speaking because there was nothing left to explain. Later, when they laid down in the bunk again, Garrett did not hesitate the way he had before. The distance between them was smaller now, bridged by choice, not circumstance. He felt her hand rest against his chest, her breath warm against his skin. For the first time in decades, Garrett Boone allowed himself to believe that life had not ended with the graves he left behind. The night passed quiet, but the silence inside the cabin was no longer hollow. It was full of work, of loss, of survival, and now of something that might endure. The days after the storm settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Garrett Boone woke before dawn as he always had, pulling on his boots and stepping out into the crisp desert air. But now when he came back through the cabin door, there was someone waiting inside. Ahiona had claimed a place in the cabin as if it had always been hers. She tended the fire without being asked, swept the floor with a bundle of straw she had tied together herself. And when Garrett returned from the barn, she often had beans soaking or corn grinding. The silence of the cabin was not gone, but it was changed. It held two lives now instead of one. Still, Garrett knew the world outside their cabin could not be kept out forever. Supplies ran low faster with two mouths to feed. The sack of flour was near empty, coffee grounds were dwindling, and salt pork would not last more than another week. He had not been to town since before he found her, and though he preferred to keep clear of Arroyo Wells, necessity was a harder master than comfort. That morning, while Ahiona worked leather ties in her hair by the fire, Garrett spoke what he had been turning over in his head for days. "I'll have to ride in soon. Flour, salt, maybe seed. Can't stretch what's left much longer." She looked up, her dark eyes steady. "Town 30 miles, she said, remembering his words from before. He nodded. "That's right. Takes most of day there and back. You go alone." The way she said it wasn't a question, but a certainty, and Garrett felt the truth of it. If he took her, the stairs would be cruel, and the risk of soldiers or men looking for trouble too great. Still, he didn't like the thought of leaving her behind. He leaned forward, forearms braced on his knees. "You'll be here. Alone. You sure you'll be all right?" Her chin lifted. "I was alone before. Here, I'm safer than out there." He wanted to argue, but the quiet confidence in her tone stopped him. He nodded once. "All right then. 2 days. Tomorrow I ride." That night he sharpened his knife by the fire, but his mind stayed on what might happen in his absence. Stray riders, drifters, even patrols, anyone could pass by the cabin. He tried to push the worry aside, but Ahiona saw it in his face. She set down the sewing she had been working on and spoke, her voice calm. "You fear for me, but I'm not helpless. If someone comes, I will know how to stand." Garrett looked at her hands, small, scarred but steady, and then at the old rifle leaning by the wall. He rose, took it down, and laid it across the table in front of her. "Then you'd better know how to use this." Her eyes lingered on the weapon, then on him. "You trust me. I wouldn't hand it to you if I didn't," he said. He showed her how to check the chamber, how to work the lever and sight down the barrel. She listened without flinching, her dark eyes sharp with focus, and when she lifted the rifle it looked almost natural in her grip. He corrected her stance, his hand brushing lightly against her shoulder as he shifted her balance. She did not pull away. By the time they banked the fire for the night, Garrett felt some measure of relief. She was not defenseless, and he had made sure she knew it. The next morning, he saddled the horse before sunrise. Ahiona stood by the doorway, her dress patched but still showing the beadwork that had survived her flight. She watched him with a calm that steadied him more than words could. He mounted and looked back. "I'll be home by dark tomorrow. Lock the door. Keep the rifle close." She nodded once. "I will wait." The ride to Arroyo Wells was long and hard. The town smelled of dust and smoke when he reached it by afternoon. Garrett bought flour, coffee, salt, and new sack of beans. He kept his head down, answering as little as possible, but he felt the eyes on him. Whispers of the old trail boss who had turned recluse still followed him here. Nobody asked questions he didn't want to answer, and by late day, he was on the road home. But trouble found him sooner than he expected. Near the ridge a mile from his land, he saw two riders cutting across the flats, men he didn't recognize. They were rough-looking, one with a red scarf tied around his neck, the other carrying a rifle in plain view. Garrett slowed his horse, eyes narrowing. He didn't stop, but he noted the direction they rode, toward his cabin. His jaw tightened. He pressed his heels and urged the horse faster. The sun was lowering when he reached the edge of his land. Smoke trailed thin from the chimney, but outside, the yard showed tracks. 2 horses had been there. He dismounted quick, rifle in hand, his heart pounding. He pushed the cabin door open. Inside, Ahiona stood with the rifle raised, her hand steady. Her chest rose and fell fast, but her eyes were sharp. On the floor near the door lay a boot print in fresh mud, but no men. They came, she said, her voice even though her breath shook. Two. They asked. They looked. I told them nothing. They left. Garrett's eyes swept the cabin, then back to her. He lowered his rifle slowly. You all right? She nodded once, lowering the weapon. I told them this place is empty, that no man stays here. They did not believe, but they went. Garrett's chest tightened. He stepped closer, setting his rifle aside. You did good. Damn good. He felt the heat of relief course through him stronger than he had expected. She met his gaze, her own steady but softer now. You see, I can stand. He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm before he could stop himself. I see, he said quietly. That night, after the supplies were stored and the door barred, Garrett sat by the fire with Ahiona beside him. The danger was not gone. Men had seen signs of life here now, and word could spread. But for the first time, he knew without question that he was not protecting her alone. She was standing with him, not behind him. As the fire burned low, Ahiona's hand found his, their fingers lacing without hesitation. Garrett Boone, who had once thought he had nothing left to give, sat with her in the quiet and knew the truth. They were already building something neither the world nor its dangers could easily break. The next morning the unease had not lifted. Garrett Boone woke before dawn, same as always, but his first thought was not of the animals or the fences. It was of the riders who had come too close. He pulled on his boots and sat at the edge of the bunk for a moment, watching Ahiona as she slept. Her breathing was steady, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She had stood her ground the day before, proved she was no helpless guest, but the knowledge that men had looked at his cabin, at her, stuck with him like a burr he couldn't shake. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, and checked the yard before light spread. Fresh tracks cut across the mud by the corral. Shallow prints, not his horses. The men had lingered longer than Ahiona had said. Garrett crouched low, pressing a hand to the dirt. The prints turned back toward the ridge, but they had paused near the barn, near the water trough. His jaw clenched. They had been searching. When he came back inside, Ahiona was up, feeding kindling into the fire. She looked at him, her sharp eyes catching his attention. They come again? She asked. Not yet, he said, setting the rifle down. But they will. Men like that don't ride out this way without reason. They saw something worth coming back for. Her gaze did not flinch. They want me. Garrett didn't answer at first. He poured coffee into 2 cups, set one in front of her, and finally said, maybe. Or maybe they just want what they think a man alone has hidden here. Either way, it doesn't matter. They come back, we deal with it. She sipped the coffee, then set it down. You fear for me, but I told you I am not weak. He studied her across the table. I don't doubt that anymore. But I've buried enough to know what happens when you take men like that lightly. His voice dropped. I won't bury again. The day was spent preparing without calling it that. Garrett checked the hinges on the cabin door, tested the shutters, and stacked wood higher by the fire. He cleaned his revolver slow and careful, laying out each piece on the table, oiling and reassembling it until the action was smooth. Ahiona worked beside him, sharpening the knife with measured strokes. The rhythm of steel against stone filled the cabin. At midday, Garrett stepped outside to split wood. The air was cool, the sky wide and pale. He swung the axe steady, but his eyes kept straying to the ridge line. Every movement he made carried the weight of watching for signs of riders. When he came back in with the wood, Ahiona had finished repairing her dress again. She stood tall, her hair braided tight, feathers and leather woven back in place. Her posture said something plain. She would not be taken for prey again. That evening they ate stew in silence, each aware of the weight between them. Afterward, Ahiona set the bowls aside and came to where Garrett sat near the fire. She stood in front of him, her gaze steady. If men come, she said, you will fight. But not only you. We fight together. Garrett looked up at her, his pale blue eyes catching the firelight. He wanted to argue, to tell her to stay behind him, to let him take the brunt of it. But he remembered her standing with the rifle, steady as any man he'd known. Slowly he nodded. Together, then, her lips pressed into a firm line, but her hand reached for his. He took it, rough, calloused fingers closing around hers. For a long moment they stood like that, the fire throwing shadows against the log walls. When they lay down that night, there was no hesitation between them. Garrett stretched out beside her, and this time she turned toward him, her hand against his chest, her breath close. He felt the steady beat of her heart where her body pressed lightly against his, and the fear of losing that pulse stronger than any fear of men on the ridge. He kissed her again, slower this time, his rough fingers brushing her cheek. She did not flinch. Her hand slid around the back of his neck, drawing him closer, not as a victim seeking protection, but as a woman making her choice. The fire burned low, and the cabin walls seemed to close around them, not as a prison, but as a shelter. Garrett let himself believe for the first time that this place, this life, might hold more than silence and loss. Yet even as he drifted into sleep with Ahiona in his arms, his mind circled back to the tracks in the mud, the riders with their rifles, and the knowledge that the world had noticed them now. He did not speak it aloud, but he knew tomorrow would bring more than chores. Tomorrow would bring a test neither of them could turn away from. The following morning broke pale and still, but Garrett Boone felt the tension before he even stepped outside. He stood at the window, pulling his vest over his shirt, watching the horizon where the ridge cut sharp against the sky. The land was too quiet. No wind through the brush, no distant hawk calls, just stillness. He turned back to the bunk where Ahiona was braiding her hair with slow, deliberate movements, feathers tied back into place. She had risen early, as if she too sensed what the day would bring. "They'll come," Garrett said. His voice was low, steady, but inside he felt the tightness coil in his chest. Ahiona tied the braid and stood. "Then we are ready." He studied her for a moment. How straight she held herself despite the bruises still fading across her skin. How calm her eyes were even with danger close. He nodded once, then reached for the rifle and checked the chamber. The revolver sat heavy on his hip, a weight both familiar and grim. He had lived years trying to put distance between himself and violence, but some things would never be left behind. By mid-morning, dust rose on the far edge of the flats. 2 riders, the same men as before, but now they weren't drifting, they were coming straight. Garrett stepped outside, rifle in hand. Ahiona followed, carrying the second rifle he had shown her to use. They stood side by side in the yard, the cabin behind them, the land stretching wide around. The men reined up 20 yards away, eyes sweeping over the pair. One spat into the dirt and called out. Didn't figure a man lived out here. Thought it was just a squaw hiding. His eyes raked over Ahiona with a look Garrett had seen before. Hungry, cruel. Garrett's voice was firm, carrying across the distance. "You've seen enough. Turn your horses and ride out." The second man laughed, rifle loose in his hand. "You don't get to tell us. We want what's in that cabin, and we'll take her besides." Garrett raised his rifle, the movement slow but certain. Ahiona lifted hers at the same time, her stance solid. The riders exchanged a glance, one shifting, uneasy. "You heard me," Garrett said. "You cross this line, you won't ride out." His words carried no heat, only the cold certainty of a man who had made his decision. The men hesitated. One spat again, muttered a curse, and jerked his reins. "Ain't worth it. Come on." With a hard kick, they turned their horses and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the wide silence. Garrett watched until they were nothing but specks. Only then did he lower the rifle, the weight of the moment pressing down hard. He turned to Ahiona. Her hands were steady, the rifle firm at her shoulder, but when she met his eyes, he saw the rush of relief behind them. "You stood," he said quietly. She nodded once. "With you." They went back inside, barring the door, and for the first time in years, Garrett felt something he had almost forgotten. Safety. Not the false safety of solitude, but the safety of knowing someone had chosen to stand with him, not behind him. He sat at the table, rubbing a hand over his face, and Ahiona poured water into 2 cups. She placed one before him, her hand brushing his as she did. "You will not be alone again," she said. The words cut deep, heavier than any oath he had spoken on trail or in town. He reached across the table and took her hand, holding it firm. "And neither will you." That night, as the firelight burned low and the cabin settled into quiet, Garrett lay beside Ahiona with her head against his shoulder. The danger had passed, at least for now, but more than that, the choice had been made. She was not a guest to be sheltered, nor a stranger to be hidden. She was his partner, his family, his future. He thought of Mary and Tom, of the graves left behind, and for the first time he felt that memory ease instead of cut. He had carried silence for too long, but no longer meant exile. It meant peace, shared with someone who had survived as much as he had. In the stillness, with her hand resting over his chest, Garrett Boone understood the truth of it. The life he thought ended years ago had begun again. Not loud, not with grand declarations, but with two people choosing to stay. And in the hard land of New Mexico, that was the strongest kind of love there was. The story of Garrett and Ahiona did not end with raids, or with fear, or with graves. It ended here, in a weather-beaten cabin at the edge of the desert, with the promise of mornings no longer faced alone.